Now, more on Egypt later in the show. 25 Christians killed now, as far as we know, and a major minister in the cabinet has resigned over this. We'll see what happens. Haven't heard too much from Amnesty International about this, and it's a segue because, look, this used to be an objective, balanced organisation, at least to most people. It got support from all different political points of view, but it seems to become an organ, Amnesty, of the hard left, targeting the US, the UK, Israel, the usual suspects. Now, in Canada, they asked for President Bush to be charged with war crimes. Mona Charon is an author and columnist, and she joins me now from sunny Washington, D.C. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, I think I'm right in saying that, when I was a young man many years ago, Amnesty was thought to be outside of the leftist sphere. It seemed to be right on most of the issues. Now it's, if anything, on the far left.
Well, it certainly was one of those organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, that seemed so great in principle. The abstract idea of having an organization that was nonpartisan and that was international and that would look at human rights violations around the world seemed to be a wonderful idea. Unfortunately, in practice and certainly over time, as you say, these organizations seem to get captured by the left. They seem to fail to make distinctions between, for example, free societies like Israel that has an independent judiciary, that has human rights organizations of its own, that has a completely free press, and the Palestinian Authority that is basically divided between the thug-run Hamas and the illegitimate Palestinian Authority, so under Abbas. So that's one problem. Another problem is that they've completely lost their sense of balance and proportion. Mm-hmm. So they recently described Guantanamo Bay as the gulag of our times. Really amazing.
I mean, for those who aren't aware, and I'm sure everyone is, but the Gulag went on for generations, and it was, hundreds, tens of millions of people went through the Gulag system. Huge numbers died. It was a complete alternative country, almost, of prisons in the Soviet Union. But let's talk about Canada for a few moments. Obviously, you're in the States, and you guys barely know we exist, but this idea of relativism, they put Zimbabwe and Canada together in one of their reports. Zimbabwe's treatment of people, which is using North Korean money and soldiers to slaughter tribes that might be rivals, and Canada, with our native population, we spend millions and millions of dollars we give to native people. It's a bit of an open wound, but we try so desperately hard. But apparently Mugabe and Stephen Harper are really just the same, just a different colour.
Well, exactly. And, that's the kind of moral equivalence that has become their stock in trade. In a column that I did about Amnesty, I described a protest that they mounted in London a few years back, which was all about closing Guantanamo Bay, and they were very hot for this. All right, fine. And they had as one of their allies in this protest a guy named Moazzam Begg, who is a former Guantanamo Bay inmate, who was released, by the way. You might get the impression from people like Amnesty that inmates are never released, but no, he was released. But he acknowledges that he was in no fewer than 3 al-Qaeda training camps, that he was a cheerful ally of the Taliban regime, and that he spoke up on he and his organization spoke up on behalf of such wonderful people as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was recently at the business end of an American predator, and other al-Qaeda heroes. And this was even a little too much for some members of Amnesty International. A gal who headed their gender unit actually made a public protest that Amnesty International ought not to be allying itself with the likes of Moazzam Begg. And for this, she was suspended.
My golly. It's not just Amnesty, though, is it? Oxfam, another organisation which we always thought of as being really good, decent people. I mean, sometimes a degree of naivety, but that can be a good thing. Some Christian organisations, not just the loony liberal Protestant groups, we've pretty much written those off, but even the Catholic Church, some of their development and justice, so-called justice wings, tend to be, or invariably, are radical, and they only see the problems of Western regimes.
Well, it is so true, and I don't know whether it's because the people who are attracted to sort of do-gooder organizations tend to be lefties, and therefore they tend to infect the organizations that they join. I'm not sure, but you know, there's an interesting case. Excuse me, the founder of Human Rights Watch actually broke with his former organization and did so publicly. He wrote an article explaining why he could no longer support Human Rights Watch, because he pointed out that they make no distinction between victims and victimizers, that they do not take into account the efforts that free societies make to live by the rule of law, to respect human rights, and so on. And so he broke with them, and you would think that would be a huge embarrassment, except that the press hardly covered it.
Yeah. Let's briefly talk about President Bush, former President Bush. Now, we can argue, have a sensible argument about foreign policy, and I happen to think Afghanistan was fully justified and Iraq was not a good idea. But that's a valid debate to have. But there are the usual crazies. He was in Toronto briefly. We hardly knew he was here. But there were the usual crazies who said he should be arrested. But then we noticed that Amnesty International actually had a press conference to say, yes, he should be charged with war crimes. Numerous communist dictators have been through, and this hasn't been suggested at all. Why this obsession with George Bush?
Well, because he's American. He is exactly the kind of American who drives a certain kind of Canadian completely around the bend, right? That Texas swagger, the obvious religiosity, and conservative Republicans. So, although from my point of view as a conservative Republican, he wasn't quite that conservative, but in any case, you know what I mean. There is that certain anti-American flavor that you find both here in the United States and in Canada. And George Bush just seems to press every one of their buttons.
Well, Mona, you know you should be arrested, really, and when you are, you'll be in prison with me, and that's how the Amnesty International support us. But I bet they won't do anything. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.